In The Witcher 3, you play as Geralt of Rivia. He's a quest-doing guy. He likes to do a lot of stuff. Basically, he really likes sorceress ladies, and he likes to kill monsters a lot, and he's generally speaking pretty much a do-gooder, like most of the time. CD Projekt Red knew what they were doing when they made this game, and so of course they added dating sim elements. Will Geralt of Rivia get together with the sexy sorceress Yennefer, or the also slightly less sexy Triss? I'm so sorry, this is really bad, isn't it? Is this bad? I think this is bad. In order to make the game make sense, both of these choices are very reasonable, knowing the story of the game. Geralt was married to Yennefer before he lost his memories. He lost his memories, then he had a love affair with Triss, got his memories back. Now he suddenly remembers that he has very reasonable reasons to be lovers with both Yennefer and Triss, but neither of them are into polygamy, so it's not going to work out very well for him in the end.
There's a difference between what's happening in the text of the story and what is happening metatextually. That is, what is happening in real life.
Yes, metatextually, you are in fact making Geralt choose whether, like, Yennefer or Triss is the person he's gonna have sex with. However, in the story, none of that happens. From a story sense, all that's happening is that Geralt is choosing one over the other. And the version of the story where he chooses either Yennefer or Triss, they're both pretty reasonable versions of Geralt. So no matter what you do, you can have a story that basically makes sense. You can almost think of playing as Geralt as essentially role-playing, like in a tabletop role-playing game, but as opposed to getting to choose your own character, you were just handed one by the DM and you have to play them instead. Now, the next little bit's going to be about you in video games. This is a pretty easy one. In a lot of old video games, especially like old JRPGs where they couldn't show you very much detail, the word you was used to mean the in-game character and also the player, kind of. Usually it means like the in-game character, but it can apply to the real person. And when Pokemon games say you caught a Pokemon, they do mean that, like, you, the player, caught a Pokemon, but in the story, it's the character catching the Pokemon. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but Deltarune uses it in the exact same way. Sometimes the game will say, you did something, but in a story sense, it's Kris doing the thing. It's not you doing it. We can chart video games by answering two questions. How much can the player affect the narrative they see, and how many innate traits do the characters have? Let's start off with number one. I'll call this narrative malleability. How much does the player get to shape the events of the narrative? In most games, you do it through a single character, but in some games, like Divinity Original Sin, they'll let you choose actions for multiple, so I'll call it narrative malleability as opposed to character malleability. But just know that it's generally one character. We can also look at how many innate traits a character has, or multiple characters have. I might just say one, okay? You got it. How much of their personality is predetermined? How much of their personality is defined at all? This is more of a narrative detail and less of a mechanical one.
I've created a handy-dandy chart to explain this and to kind of chart characters and see how they're different from each other, and we're going to go through a few examples to kind of show how these work in practice.
In the Pokemon games, you have a pretty low narrative and malleability. You kind of do the same stuff every time. However, it lets you be in the shoes of the trainer, because if you're playing Pokemon, you probably want to go and beat people in Pokemon battles, and that's half of what those narratives are about. But the character also has very few innate traits. They don't talk at all. So you can project yourselves onto them very easily. You can very easily roleplay, and you get to choose which Pokemon you have, so you get to express yourself. The Elder Scrolls games have very high narrative malleability. You can choose to go on the main story, but you can also choose to totally ignore it. You can choose to be a murdering maniac, or you can choose to kill no one and just sneak around and, I don't know, do whatever else people do in Skyrim. You choose what quests you go on, and some quests even let you choose what happened in the quests. By giving you these choices, you can craft a narrative where your character does have some personality traits, but nevertheless they're all decided by the player. Thus, little to no innate traits, high narrative malleability. The Witcher 3, then, is pretty unusual, isn't it? The game has a pretty high narrative malleability. In fact, it has more narrative malleability than a lot of games with less fleshed out, I'll say, main characters. However, Geralt also has a pretty high number of innate traits. His personality is pretty consistent no matter what you do. As I said, the game kind of balances this out by not letting Geralt do stuff that's too out of character, but you can still kind of push it and just make him a piece of garbage and kill people all the time, so I guess this doesn't always work out. Nevertheless, I think given the very positive reaction to Witcher 3 from just about everybody, including myself, I'd say they did a pretty darn good job of it.
In our last corner, we have characters with low narrative malleability and a high number of innate traits. These are basically just normal characters. These are characters as you see them in basically any other standard form of fiction, and also just any non-player characters in video games.
Part 2. Everything you need to know about Kris. So, it's pretty important at this point to do a little breakdown of what's going on in Deltarune. So let's get started with that. The intro of Deltarune features a mysterious narrator telling the player, yes, actually the player this time, there's no character has been introduced yet. It's a character creator screen. You're told to pick a bunch of features for your character, like whether left leg big, right leg big, like whatever, different hairstyles, I think there's different clothes, and you choose all these details, and then the narrator says, actually, screw you. You don't get to choose who you are. Sorry. You don't get to have an opinion. Your opinion doesn't matter. Your name is Kris. The game gives you the impression that you're going to be playing a character who has very few innate traits. And this is how the main character of Undertale was as well. Frisk. This is how Frisk was in Undertale as well. However, this is not who you're playing in Deltarune. In fact, Kris in Deltarune actually has quite a few innate traits. The game tells you here that your name is Kris, and this is a very important detail that a lot of people don't seem to get right. Anyways, the game says your name is Kris. That means essentially that you and Kris mean the same thing in this game, right? Like you're playing as Kris. All of your actions in real life translate to Kris's actions in the game. Makes sense? Alright, cool. That's a pretty standard stuff. It's like in Pokemon. But usually games that use you don't have a character with this many innate traits. And the thing is, it's been made pretty clear that Kris is actually a character with a lot of innate traits. Like, they got a lot of stuff going on. A good little hint as well is that Toby Fox likes to use characters' bedrooms to communicate stuff about their characters. In Undertale, Frisk never really had their own bedroom, but in Deltarune, you see one side of the room that has medals and looks very happy, and you see Kris's side of the room, which, well, it doesn't look like that. It doesn't look quite like the other one. Like, Kris clearly has a lot of stuff going on. Their brother just left for college. Like, there's a lot of stuff happening. And a lot of other people talk about Kris as if they have a lot of innate traits. Kris also is very quiet, which again is pretty standard video game protagonist fare, but is also made pretty clear as a part of Kris's personality. Kris meets up with Susie, they get paired up with Susie to work on a group project. They go looking for chalk together, some stuff happens, they end up meeting a mysterious goat boy named Geralt, who is apparently the prince of an alternate world, which is the Darkener world, and there's apparently a prophecy they're going to save the world together. Very Persona of them, very JRPG of them, but, like, who cares? It's a good setup, alright? Like, don't fix it if it ain't broke. This setup leaves essentially with Kris in charge. Why? Well, Susie doesn't want to make decisions, and she isn't really the biggest fan of tactics, and Rolse has self-esteem issues, and will only do stuff that Kris wants to do, because he's very certain that his only purpose for existing is serving Lighteners, serving people like Kris and Susie. So Kris kind of just ends up in charge by accident, and whatever their decisions are end up kind of being the decisions of the whole party. We have a few innate traits of Kris overall, despite the fact that we don't really get very much from them in like the moment-to-moment dialogue. They're capable of leadership, they're at least kind of smart, but they're not very accomplished, and they seem like pretty darn depressed. A lot of people seem to think they're acting differently lately. They used to play piano, but they don't anymore. And just in general, kind of a weird kid, but there's also some shades of like, oh, they were kind of a prankster, and they like to do weird stuff. Like, Kris is given the choice to eat moss at one part of the game. That's pretty weird. No, most people wouldn't eat moss off the ground, I'd say. And there's a couple other moments as well, where Kris is sort of like prankster, kind of goofy element of themselves starts to shine through a little bit, but overall, a pretty quiet teenager. Here's the thing about Toby Fox. He likes to make games with a lot of narrative malleability. Okay, well, I think he only has like 2. I didn't play anything before Undertale. Sorry, I didn't play I don't know if there's obscure Toby Fox stuff I'm missing. But the point is that in Undertale, a lot of the conceit was that you get to play as a character, and you get to kind of choose to do whatever you want, and the game very much responds to you choosing different things. In Deltarune, the game still does respond to you choosing different things, but you're playing as a character who has a lot more personality to them, so it's a little weirder that you get to choose stuff for them, and that's part of the reason this puppet theory kind of exists.
I kind of in part interpret people's suspicion and people's wonders about the nature of Kris's character to the fact that the kinds of characters that are referred to with you in video games generally lie in like the bottom left of my little chart here. And the character from Toby Fox's previous game is in the top left of this chart. Like, they're very much in the left quadrant. So I think Kris's move to the right side of the quadrant has kind of confused people. It's kind of thrown people off, especially because the game uses you. I think that's a pretty big part of it.
Let's recap the theory. The idea is that unlike Geralt in The Witcher 3, who makes choices of his own volition in the story, and then, just metatextually you're choosing stuff for him, but, you're kind of role-playing as him, like a role-playing game, art, whatever. Anyways, people think that Kris is being controlled by an antagonistic force, that is, the player, who is essentially overriding their will, and forcing them to do things, or at least some stuff, against their own will. Like, they're a separate character. Their character is not determined by the choices you make and changed by those choices. Rather, their character is actually just hidden. Their character is stifled by the player's iron, or not very iron, very inconsistent grip on them, I suppose. And the thing is, I do think people are pretty reasonable to read the story like this. If you read the story as one where Kris doesn't have any free will, then you can pretty easily explain away a lot of the bad route stuff. Like, there's an evil route in chapter 2, it's called Snowgrave. It's like a very specific thing, but it explains away why Kris is just a bad person, just a really bad person. I'm not gonna spoil it. So it explains that away, because it's just the player making them do that. It also explains away any mean decisions Kris can make, because it's just the player actually doing those things. Players have also seen how other characters are shocked by Kris's behavior, and they're like, oh, well, it looks like, I guess, Kris is actually being mind-controlled, and that's why everyone's surprised. And while this theory does have some decent explanatory power, it's very important to not confuse explanatory power with, like, actual evidence. Like, explaining stuff just means it's a theory. Like, that's like the defining part of a theory. Explanatory power is like, that's what you need, alright? What we're looking for, though, is like cold hard evidence. We do need evidence to make sure the theory is true. Part 3, the textual evidence for this theory. There's a decent bit of it, but some of it's not very great. A lot of it's just stuff that the theory explains, and not actually stuff that needs to be explained. Like, some stuff is explained by the theory, but didn't need explaining. Some stuff does need explaining, and isn't very well explained by other stuff, and explained by the theory. Well, that's our first one right here. At the beginning of the game, when you go to save your game, you have to save over a slot that has Kris's names on it, and that name is replaced with the player's name from the start of the game. This could mean something, but it could also be that so you could tell which save file is which from the name on it. Also, when you go to the blank save file screen, there's no save files that have Kris's name on them. It just kind of appears in this first screen. So maybe it means something, but it doesn't seem to have carried over to the save file screen, so I'm a little iffy on this one. Evidence 1. Kris rips the soul, which we control, out of their body, and we can still control the soul, even when it's separated. Now, this scene does establish two things. One is that Kris's body can act independently of their soul, heart, or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it their soul. It's the little heart in the game, though. Now, when the body rips out the soul, the player can only control the soul while the body acts independently. What does this mean? Some people think this means that Kris is the body and the player is the soul. However, this view is pretty much directly contradicted by the game's pros. As I mentioned, the very first thing this game tells you is that you're being forced to roleplay as a specific character, and that character is Kris. So if either part of that, whatever is happening there, is Kris, it's almost certainly the soul that you're assigned to, because you're told your name is Kris, and in this game, you is used interchangeably with Kris. They're probably connected. Like, this is the most frustrating thing I see, and I think ultimately this is where the theory immediately falls apart. I don't think Toby Fox is doing some sort of triple possession nonsense. That's crazy. It would be a crazy thing to do. It's possible, but I think it's crazy. The other thing is that the other personality seems to act pretty explicitly paranormal. Most people don't fling their own body out of bed or have red glowing eyes. So, if in this case, if we know there's some sort of other force that the player doesn't get to control controlling Kris, that would mean double possession. And I don't like that. I think it's nonsense. Evidence part 3. Kris is clearly disturbed by Spamton in chapter 2. I'm not going to show a picture of this, but there's a scene where you can choose whether or not Kris says they're alright after someone asks if they're okay. Whether or not Kris says yes or no, they're clearly not alright. Frankly, I don't even want to explain this, but it's not very weird for someone to say they're fine and visibly not be fine. Spamton's a pretty weird guy. People will also talk about how Spamton says a lot about puppets and strings, but Spamton also says that the entire party is held up by strings, so if he was really referring to Kris's strings being like the player controlling them, then he probably wouldn't have referred to the entire party. He also establishes that the whole party has at least 2 souls, meaning that souls in this game don't exclusively represent the player, which further makes it unlikely that actually the heart is indeed the player and that the body is Kris. Evidence part 4. Snowgrave. In Deltarune chapter 2, you basically have the option of going on a secret route where Kris is just the absolute worst. They're a sadistic, horrible person in ways far deeper than just beating up monsters like you can in the first chapter. Now, this is pretty much the most major out-of-character moment for Kris, and another reason why people think Kris is being mind-controlled. And while I do think this is one of the more reasonable pieces of evidence, it's also not evidence, it's just something that's explained by the theory. Remember, a theory's explanatory power doesn't actually mean evidence for it. And this doesn't really provide much evidence other than that there's a voice that doesn't sound like Kris. But we've already established that there's some other being that's possessing Kris, as evidenced in the end of chapter 1. I don't think it's that unreasonable that Kris has another voice coming from them when we already know they're being possessed. And unless they're double possessed, I certainly don't think that's supposed to be the player. I would certainly argue that Snowgrave makes far more sense as Kris has some sort of other personality, or maybe that the other side of Kris that possesses them is like some sort of other value or some sort of other ideal that takes over and starts taking over Kris's actions. And then you have the game be about the like push and pull of these two different ideals and like ways of acting and like motivations. I certainly think it makes more sense than the player having mind controlling Kris, because mind control is dumb and stupid, and I'll get to that later. And I would like to also establish that people use the fact that Kris fourth wall breaks in this part. However, there's different types of fourth wall breaks. See, characters in this game don't actually fourth wall break. Like the mechanics of the game exist in the game, for the most part. We know the battle screen exists, and we know the text boxes exist. Ralsei mentions the UI, so it's not that weird that Kris is able to see it. So that doesn't mean it's necessarily the player, since the player doesn't get to control Ralsei, and Ralsei can also see the game's UI. This was going to be an audio segment, but I have very strong feelings about this. Let's talk about the T theory. The tea theory is where this theory gets its name from some people. The basic idea is that there's a tea shop in the game, and they sell tea based off of each of the characters. Everyone's tea tastes very bland to themselves, and the other character's tea heals a certain amount of HP, and each character has like a little reaction dialogue at the bottom when they drink each other's tea. It's a very cute little thing. Some people don't think it's just a cute little thing. Well, here's a little picture of the chart. People have spun this chart, and along with the flavor text that goes along with it, as, oh wait, hold on a minute. Kris heals more from Susie's tea than Kris heals from Ralsei's tea. And Ralsei heals more from Kris's tea than Kris heals from Ralsei's tea. That must mean that Kris doesn't actually like Ralsei very much, and that the player is forcing Kris to hug Ralsei on the multiple occasions where that happens, forcing them into intimacy they're not comfortable with, showing the player as the antagonist of this game. It's not good. It's bad. It's a bad theory. First of all, I have a few problems with the premise. So people will take the T theory to essentially mean that the amount that HP heals is representing how much the characters like each other, right? Noelle likes Susie, has a crush on Susie in the plot, so Noelle heals a crap ton from Susie's. However, that's the only real part of it that supports this. There's also a bit like, okay, Noelle doesn't heal very much from Ralsei's tea. Okay, well actually she says it's empty, which may be a joke or something, we don't know. If it was really based on how much the characters liked each other, I don't understand why the characters would then be would only get 10 HP from their own tea. I think it may genuinely be much more flavor text than it actually is like real story stuff. Not to mention the fact that trying to distill two characters' relationship with each other down to like bloody numbers on a chart is just not a very genuine way or a very interesting or true way to like describe relationships whatsoever. Not to mention in the actual text, the only tea at all that Kris reacts to is Susie's tea, which they seem to like. They even react positively to Ralsei's tea. It just doesn't heal as much as Susie's does. This could mean anything. We just don't have enough data to interpret this. But people will still use this as one of the main tenets to prove that the player is actually controlling Kris, that the player exists in game and is controlling Kris. And it's easily some of the worst evidence because there's just so little to verify it. I would certainly not put the importance of like the multiple times where Kris is given choices to be kind to Ralsei over how much the frickin' tea heals, okay? Am I just saying this because I ship Kris and Ralsei? Yes, I am. Like, I'm admitting it, okay? Yeah, this is the entire reason this video exists, is because I'm like, wow, what a lovely ship. And there's even like a bunch of evidence for it existing in the game. Like Toby Fox clearly is doing a little sneaky, he put it in the game a lot. But then I see fan art and I see Tumblr posts where people are like, whoa, it looks like Kris doesn't like Ralsei very much. And I'm like, God, what? Like, no, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you can choose how much Kris likes Ralsei. Like, at least Kris likes Ralsei a little bit, but I don't think there's anything to say that they don't like Ralsei. Like, why would Toby Fox put all those choices in the game if that's what we're supposed to get from it? It doesn't make any sense. 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 You know what makes more sense? That the player isn't controlling Kris, because that's a ludicrous way to interpret a story. I'm very sorry if you like this theory a lot. If you want your headcanon, that's great. but it's garbage.
And also, of course, nothing that happens in the game even implies romance. I just like the ship because I like it. All it really shows is that they are, like, genuinely good friends, and I certainly don't think that you can try and say that there's a significant gap between Kris and Ralsei's friendship and Kris and Susie's friendship, especially when Ralsei and Kris basically work together to help Susie out throughout the entirety of the first chapter.
Am I just mad about this because I ship Kris and Ralsei, and I'm tired of people claiming that by me having Kris be affectionate to Ralsei, I'm literally forcing someone into a close relationship that they're uncomfortable with? Yes, that's why I'm 6 pages into this script. But should I feel bad for having Geralt to get together with Yennefer when the game's premise essentially lets you roleplay as the character and romance whichever character you'd like? Like, it's a role-playing game. Of course you're going to play the role. Like, the character's going to be different based on who's playing it. That's like the core conceit of role-playing games. I know Toby Fox made it confusing, but let's just keep going, okay? It's going to become more obvious. Sometimes Kris acts without the player doing anything, or just generally does stuff that's conflicting with the player. Like, there's one part where Kris examines like a door, and then is like, actually, I don't want to look at that. And there's some parts where, like, Kris will do stuff in cutscenes. This really just shows that Kris is a character like Geralt from The Witcher 3, and not a character like the Pokemon trainer or like Frisk from Undertale. I've kind of already covered all that stuff, so I'm not going to spend super long here. And I'm going to use this to address a couple other things as well. Some people use the fact that Ralsei talks to Kris when the player isn't around as evidence. This is more just evidence that the story is like a third-person limited omniscient perspective, whatever they call it in English class. The point is, you aren't like solely from Kris's perspective in this game, and then the characters have conversations that you aren't aware of. You don't get to know about everything in this game. I think it's pretty cool. I think it's a good storytelling mechanism. I certainly wouldn't say it means that the player is a character in the game, and it doesn't really add evidence. It's just something that's explained by the theory. Like, it kind of makes sense, but it also just shows that the player's mind control, if this is true, is not very strong. Like, what kind of mind control is good enough to control all of Kris's actions, but is not good enough to keep that control when, like, Ralsei is like, let's go think about Susie for a little bit. Or when, like, a cutscene happens, or just random times where your choices don't matter very much. It just seems like pretty crappy mind control to me. And mind control's crap anyways when it works properly, and it's even more crap when it doesn't work properly. Evidence 6. Kris's personality. The text demonstrates that Kris has been acting differently lately, and that 2 different personalities seem to exist inside of Kris. One that comes around at night and takes out their own heart, and another one that is kinder but mostly just depressed. Really, we just know that Kris doesn't seem to have very many friends, but when they did have friends, was a kind of a prankster, actually like a pretty funny person in general. But a lot of it changed after their older brother left for college, who's coming home soon. When you're choosing a team name, Kris doesn't even get to put a name in. There's no option that is Kris comes up with the name themselves. Like, Kris clearly is just kind of going through the motions in a lot of these plots. If Kris is a kind of sad kid who isn't very social and was never as accomplished as their older brother and liked to play pranks according to the background info we have, then, other than Snowgrave, and even then, the choices are pretty much consistent with this idea. Kris used to play piano, but now refuses to. They hang out with their older brother at the time, and now he's gone at college. They have a very even disposition, and they're not very emotional. And all of these are traits that we see Kris embody, like, actively in the present. Part 4. I don't think the T-theory is right, because I think it's just really freaking lame, alright? It's lame, I'm sorry. From a story perspective, it's really lame. It doesn't work very well. And I'm gonna explain why. Here's the reasons why. A. Places where the player is given agency don't, like, consistently align or don't align with Kris's character. Like, as a narrative thread, it's clearly just not very well portrayed, right? Like, some of Kris's choices are pretty obviously based off of Kris's personality, but then random other ones are not based off of Kris's personality as it's established in the backstory, which I think is pretty weird if the player is controlling all of it. Like, what's up with that? Like, if the generation of these choices is supposed to be up to some sort of, like, impartial third party that I guess is representing the player or whatever, it's pretty weird that randomly then, like, the choices start aligning with Kris's personality. Like, come on, like, how would the player even know what Kris's personality is? Like, I guess you learn about it, but you didn't know about the moss thing. How can Kris be funny to the player if the player is the one coming up with it in the first place? What, is Kris eating moss just us being funny to ourselves? Maybe, I guess. I'm not that funny. I'm not funny enough to come up with Kris eating moss. My goodness. B. The player is a really boring character. I read this book, The Night Circus, and it also tried to do this second person thing in a more direct way than Deltarune does, where it, like, says you do things, like, you know, you walk around in this circus and you're curious about things, but it ultimately ends up being kind of cringeworthy because you can't assign characteristics to you. Like, you could be anyone. I can't say you're mean or you're curious or you're good at math class. Come on, you're not good at math class. The player is a really boring villain. I feel like this one's kind of obvious based off the fact that they're a really boring character, but they're also not a very functional antagonist either. Like, they don't fulfill a very particular role in the story. Again, they don't have any characteristics. They don't have any motivation. They're basically just forced into this by the developers, which really just puts them on the same level as Kris. Like, they're just also being mind controlled. We've got 3 different mind controls now. We got Kris being mind controlled by 2 different entities, and we have the player who's being mind controlled by the freaking developers of the game. And on that matter, really, in the end, the developers actually mind control all the characters, because all the characters are actually just fictional. Their lives are created by authors who write them down on pieces of paper. You see where this line of reasoning leads? Point D, Kris is a blank slate now. Like, we lose a lot of the characterization of Kris that we get to do throughout the gameplay if we assume it's all mind control. If it's all mind control, Kris is doing none of these things. Kris doesn't eat moss with Susie. Kris doesn't get the banana. You make them do it. I think that's lame. I think it's really lame. It's so lame. What? No, obviously it's Kris doing those things, because Kris is a chaotic gremlin moron. Like, God, I love them. They're great. Like, no, I'm not going to take away all of Kris's characterization throughout the game for the sake of this player mind control nonsense. Casting the player as the villain doesn't really help you, like, narratively, because, as I said, it doesn't give you a very good character. So there must be some other reason to do it, right? Well, I guess what do you get from a story perspective? Well, the story is saying that when you play the game, you're mind controlling the character. I guess you could say it's commentary, but it's just wrong commentary, right? Like, no, it's not a reasonable interpretation of any role-playing game to say that by playing the game, you're mind controlling the character. By playing the game, you're creating the character. Like, I think tabletop role-playing games are a really good example to compare this to, because in those games, you make all the decisions, and the whole idea is that the character is, like, created by you. You get to craft a character through your decisions, and that's part of the fun. It's a role-playing game. It's right there in the title. Like, of course, that's what you do in the game. Acting like it's somehow wrong to do that, or acting like it's akin to mind control, is like saying that writing a character at all is akin to mind control. Like, no, it's not. It's not. No, you created the character in the first place. It's called suspension of disbelief. Like, it's fiction. That's how this works. We're imagining a world that doesn't really exist. Like, we're getting close to dangerously bad ethics discourse. So this one's a little bit of a doozy, but if we're really going to take the theme at heart that, yes, the player is mind controlling Kris, obviously mind control is bad no matter how you do it. But technically, I guess the best thing to do would probably be to play Kris to be as, like, similar to the established traits we know of as possible. But yeah, then we're just getting dangerously close to people policing how other people play the game, or like trying to figure out which version of the story is the best version based off of how close the player's choices are to Kris's actual personality, whatever the hell that means. It's nonsense. You just can't, it doesn't make sense. It's not a reasonable way to interpret the story, and it's not how the game is obviously asking you to interpret the story. While I do realize that without the Deltarune player theory, some stuff genuinely does not have a very good explanation. Like, Snowgrave and the evil routes don't really make much sense, they don't really fit with the themes of the game very well yet, and we haven't really made sense of those yet. And then I guess you could argue the T theory, no, the T theory doesn't need explanation. I'm not going to buy that nonsense. Yes, the Snowgrave isn't very well explained without the player theory. However, we're 2 chapters in. It doesn't need an explanation yet. We're 2 chapters in. We're 2 chapters in. We're two chapters in. Not everything needs an explanation yet. It certainly doesn't need an explanation that just blows up how you're supposed to interpret the game. I don't buy it. It doesn't make any sense. Whew. Okay, we're almost done. Now, the alternative to all this theory crafting and stuff is that we actually spend our time looking at what the game spends the majority of its text actually talking about. Like, why does Ralsei have such low self-esteem that he immediately falls in love with Kris a little bit just because Kris compliments them a couple times? Or why does Susie become a nicer person so quickly after being so cruel to Kris, like, immediately earlier in the game? Like, we could talk about that character arc. Wouldn't that be interesting? I think it's interesting. As much as I don't understand why everyone's horny for Spamton when the Queen and the Swatchlings are right there, I have also learned a lot about Spamton's character from like the Spamton AUs and lore and stuff. Like I think that's interesting because you're actually looking at the text of the game as opposed to just theorizing wild stuff about like the future of it and predictions MatPat style. You could actually go choice by choice and look at how the choices that Kris can make sort of reflect different parts of Kris's personality. I think that would be an interesting analysis to make, but I guess we're not doing it because the Kris Deltarune wiki page is too focused on talking about how Kris is actually not a character at all, and is just being stifled by the player. Deltarune is a game about fluffy boys and mean girls and banging music. Computer MILF orders Kris to grab banana. Do they do it? Do they not do it? Important part of the story. Kris and Susie eat moss together, and it's great. Ralsei refuses to swear even though you choose it for their team name, but personally, I think Ralsei will come around if something really big happens, and I'm very excited for that. Even if the player has an entire page on the Deltarune wiki, it doesn't mean they're real. Anyways, just go play Deltarune, okay? Like 90% of the game is just watching dumbasses be gay and go on adventures together, and that's like so much of a better pitch than actually these dumbasses are being mind controlled by the player into doing stuff against their will. It's just cooler, I don't know. I like gay people, what can I say? Damn. I'm a simple person.